Hello and welcome back to another recording session for Monster Hunter World Iceborne. We are jumping straight back into the continued adventures of our Hunter Elta, and it has been a few weeks since the last recording session that I did. As of the time I'm recording this, I just got back from a trip on the road and was out of town for a bit, and just due to that and work, I haven't been able to get back to Monster Hunter. The progress I've made since the last time I recorded an actual series of episodes is not too significant. The last thing we did on camera, I believe, was taking out acidic Glavins. The next key quest I haven't done yet, which is why it's unchecked in the upper right. I did run some multiplayer hunts with random people online and some with my friend Flammy. And the most significant thing to come out of those runs is I crafted the Acidic Glavinus Greatsword. And we can take a look at that real quick to see, since I don't believe I had this when I left off at the end of the last recording. The Acid Shredder 1, which is the first tier of Greatsword, starts with a raw attack of 1296. No innate element, no innate affinity. It has paralysis element on awakening, which I don't have, but this thing is basically a brute force, pure raw damage greatsword. The level of sharpness on it is a little bit lower than the Palace greatsword I was using before, but overall this thing stacks some serious raw damage, and with the elementless decoration, it boosts my attack up pretty significantly. When it's all said and done, I'm walking around with 1339 attack, which is pretty significant. I've had a chance to road test this weapon a little bit, and it's decently powerful. I've found it doing comparable damage to most things I've been fighting. The rest of my gear is still the Glavinus set. I get the feeling this armor set is going to take me all the way to the end of the game. Depending on if anything from other monsters comes up sooner, if this is functional and doesn't require any more fine-tuning, I may keep this for now until we get to the end game, where we start really optimizing things for our weapon. But for now, the Glavinus set, in addition to looking pretty cool, is very functional. So I see no reason to change it right now. Hopefully with this session we can make some more progress towards the story, towards the end game. As of the day I'm recording this, we're about a week or so away from the next major update on PC, and I believe the next update is going to be Safi Jiva, the addition of Stygian Zinogre, a new zone for the end game, and the siege against Safi, which I want to be able to jump into with some friends of mine. To that end, I'd like to proceed as far as I can and try and hopefully get closer to the end game. Might not be able to clear the story in this particular session, but might be able to get close. In the time since the last recording, as I've been playing online and doing side quest stuff, I did want to show off something that I finally finished that I kind of teased in the last episode. And that is a Gunlancer set. This was mostly done when I recorded the last episode. I just recently finished the last piece I needed for it. Real quickly, take a look at the loadout that I put together for this. This is not my totally optimized Gunlancer set. I'd say it's about 75% functional for what I normally slot into skills on Gunlance, but for the sake of the Let's Play and being able to go out and play around with this weapon, the set will do for now. If we go to the equipment info, the Gunlance we're using is the Viper Toby Kadachi Gunlance, the Crimson Ember Plus. That is level 2 upgrade on Viper Toby's weapon, I believe. It carries the paralysis element, which is fitting for the monster. Overall attack is 603. After buffs, its base is 575. 15% affinity, and the element is 300 paralysis. The shelling type is long, level 5. What I want to do after I do a quick overview of the gear I put together is actually do like I did for the Insect Glaive and do a real quick and dirty rundown of the Gunlance playstyle and how I play the weapon. But before we do that, let's go through the gear real quick. I'm currently wearing the Silver Knight layered armor. The pieces that I've put together in this sort of cobbled together Gunlancer set looks kind of goofy. If we go back to our chest here, I'll turn off my layered armor so you guys can see what it looks like right now. On the head, we've got the Brachydios helm, which I've got hidden. This one took me a while to get because the Bracpalium that I needed for the headgear just would not drop. I probably took out about half a dozen Brachydios. But I got it. On the head, we've got Agitator, which is increasing attack power when monsters enter rage mode. But the reason why I built this particular armor piece is for capacity boost. And in case I hadn't mentioned it before, capacity boost increases a certain ammo type overall capacity. Gunlance shells, which I'll explain when we go into the training area, and the Charge Blades files are affected by capacity boost. This is pretty helpful for a Gunlancer set, and I'll explain why when we actually take a look at the weapon. Chest piece, we've got the Horcry Mail Beta Plus. This is the Shrieking Legiana, which we spent some time farming off camera. My friend Flammy helped me with a couple runs, and I ended up having to do several more. The Shrieking variant gives this particular chest piece on the beta with more slots, and the reason I built it is for focus level 2. On the hands, we've got the Maximum Might and Focus skills from the Glavins set. On the waist, we have the Uragan Coil Alpha Plus. It gives us Part Breaker and Guard. And then Uragan Legs gives us Beta Plus, gives us Guard, 2 points in Guard. And the charm I built is Artillery, which is very, very useful skill for Gunlance. And Artillery increases the power of shells by 30% and reduces Wyvern's fire cooldown by 50%. The rest of the gear are Bandit Mandel and Health Booster, what we're running with the other weapons that we've been using. Overall, the total skill loadout is the 2-piece set skill for Uragan, which is Guard Up. This allows us to block things that we wouldn't normally be able to block. Certain monster attacks, some of the projectile attacks that we couldn't block normally with a guarding weapon are blockable when we have this set skill active. For a more defensive and tanky Gunlancer build, which is what I run, being able to just sit there and block big hits is pretty important. Focus 3 reduces the charge time on things by 15%. I will demonstrate what that means for Gunlance later. Artillery is our boost to shelling power and Wyvern's fire cooldown. Guard 3 greatly reduces the impact of attacks and reduces stamina depletion by 15%. I believe we talked about it briefly when I was first introducing the Great Sword and its ability to guard. The impact stagger and stamina chip you take from guarding attacks depends on the weapon. The Lances, Lance and Gunlance, have the strongest shields in the game and are capable of soaking big hits, but they'll still stagger a little bit and take stamina chip. Putting points into guard reduces the amount of stagger and stun that you get from tanking a hit, and also reduces the amount of stamina chip you get taken off of your bar when you're guarding. I usually like to run guard 5, which is very resistant to impacts, and your stamina depletion chip is reduced by 50%. Basically means, even with the exception of some really, really strong attacks, you can sit there and brace against whatever and it won't knock you over. Right now, we're only up to level 3 with the particular equipment pieces we've got, which is fine for now. As we proceed, if I manage to get something else that can slot in with more guard points, or I win the lottery and get some guard decorations, I'll probably slot them in to get that up closer to 5. Part Breaker, part damage plus 20%. Agitator is the enraged boost. Maximum might when stamina is full, 20% affinity boost. Earplugs level 1, which I slotted into 3-star decoration just because I had an extra slot. Attack boost 1, weakness exploit. These are sort of ancillary things that I got from random decorations. Resuscitate, which comes from the crisis decoration, is helpful for blight affliction. It'll give you increased evade window and stamina depletion mitigation when you have an abnormal status blight inflicted. And capacity boosters are overall clip size up. Speed sharpening level 1 makes it faster to sharpen. Divine blessing reduces damage taken by 15% randomly. Slinger capacity is overall slinger ammo up. Tool specialist shortens mantle cooldown and booster cooldown by 10%. Overall, pretty diverse mix of skills. Ideally, we'd have things dialed in a little bit more for the weapon, but because I don't have a ton of decorations to work with, I sort of threw random stuff on here that'd be helpful in a fight. Anyway, what I'd like to do is head over to the training area and go through a more detailed breakdown of the Gunlance. The first part of this recording session is going to be devoted to just a sort of informal weapon tutorial. I think I mentioned it earlier on, but for really in-depth mechanic overviews, I highly recommend checking out some folks from the community like Gaijin Hunter or Eric's. They do fantastic breakdowns of Monster Hunter weapon mechanics, and they could probably explain things a lot better than I can. But real quickly, since I'm going to be running Gunlance throughout the playthrough, we'll kind of explain how the weapon functions. From a standing position, if we draw the weapon, we have standard draw. The Gunlance, being a slower weapon, takes a little bit longer to fully unsheath. You have your hunter take the ready position and then it unfolds. So it doesn't quickly just pop out like some of the lighter weapons. If you are moving and you hit triangle, remembering the PlayStation controls, the unsheath attack is a forward lunging up thrust. This has a little bit of carry forward, and it will hit upwards above your hunter, which is handy for hitting things out of reach like tails, and it'll give you a little bit of forward momentum. With the weapon out, there are a few crucial things that the Gunlance can do. For attacks, by hitting triangle once, you have the lateral thrust, or the poke. You can chain the poke 3 times before the attack animation resets. In addition to just chaining hits with the poke, if you hit triangle and circle at the same time, you get the rising slash. You can mix up your hits in between your forward pokes and your rising slashes by mixing your inputs up. However, if you do the lateral thrust, the up thrust, and then you hit triangle again, you get the overhead smash. And the overhead smash is a pretty hard hitting. You can do it on the pillar here and see the damage numbers. The overhead smash is one of the strongest attacks that the Gunlance has. It's slower and has a bit more of an active window, so you'll want to make sure you're selective on when you use it, because you're a bit more open when you're using it, and you don't want to leave yourself vulnerable. After a successful overhead slam, if you hit circle, you'll do a burst fire, which unloads your entire clip of shells. The Gunlance shell clip is right next to my sharpness bar in the upper left. It's currently flashing empty because I discharged all my shells at once. To reload your shells, hold down R2 for guard and hit circle. It's a full reload. That will refill both your clip of shells and your worm stake. I will get to the worm stake in a minute. In addition to the full burst, if you just hit circle, you can shell. Shelling discharges one shell at a time from your clip, and you can do that until you run out. Hitting circle 3 times for essentially 3 shelling prompts gives you the worm stake cannon. This thing launches a projectile from your gun lance that at close range will stick into the target and slowly burn a short fuse before exploding for damage. It's a little bit hard to see because of the clipping on the actual pillar here. But by sticking the worm stake into the target, you get a burst of damage that goes off after a few seconds. And the worm stake needs to be reloaded by doing the full reload with R2 and circle. For regular shelling, the gun lance can also quick reload. If you hit circle to shell, and then you hit R2 and circle, you do a quick reload. And I have to remember how many shells you can reload at once. We'll test that here. If we empty our clip completely, poke, quick reload, it fully refills the clip. The quick reload didn't always do that in older games. But the handy thing about the quick reload is that you can do it after any regular attacks. The lateral poke, as long as you hit R2 and circle before the animation completely finishes, you essentially cancel the animation and you quick reload. So part of the game, depending on the type of gun lance you're using, involves mixing up your stabs and your shells. As a result, you can sort of poke, shell, poke, and as long as you're careful and watch your timing, you can keep the pressure on enemies and do a lot of damage. And I believe the shelling damage for gun lance behaves a little bit differently from regular weapon hits, in that shelling ignores armor and does flat damage to parts. It's considered, I want to say, might be fire elemental or neutral element. I haven't had to look that up in a while. But unlike things that are based on sharpness or the toughness of a monster part, shelling is flat damage, which is why artillery is useful for boosting the damage shelling does if you're using a shelling build type weapon. Or I guess shelling type gun lance build. In addition to the offensive attacks, the gun lance has a hop, which it shares with the regular lance. Hitting X with no input gives you a hop back, and you can chain that as long as you have stamina in order to get out of range of an attack or to move around and reposition. In addition to the back hop, the gun lance has the ability to evade out of attacks as well. If you hit evade to the side or back after you do any sort of attack, you can move and also reposition that way. The side hop is really important, especially for fast-moving targets, because you can poke, sidestep, shell, poke, and despite this being a slower weapon, it actually gives you a pretty decent amount of mobility. In addition to the side hops and the back hops, one thing they added in World, which I really liked, is the front hop. If you hit forward and evade with your weapon out, you'll do this sort of lunge. And this gives you the ability to close distance with the gun lance that is very handy. Older games didn't have this. You had fewer options for forward movement with the gun lance, but the ability to forward, evade, and also chain which direction you go, lets you sort of reposition easily. It's quite handy. Let's see. Talked about the basic attacks, the movement, the guarding. Hitting R2 will allow you to guard. And you can move while you're guarding, albeit rather slowly. And if you hit triangle while you're guarding, you can do a guard thrust, which allows you to poke from behind the safety of your shield. And just like all of the other moves, you can quick reload at the end of your guard poke as well. Let's see. Another move, I'm trying to think in my head all the different things I usually do with the Gunlance. If we go back to the thrust and the overhead swipe, if you follow the overhead smash with wide sweep, which is another triangle, you get this lateral wide range slap with the Gunlance. It's useful for hitting things around you. I don't use that one too much with this particular build, but it is useful, especially if you need to clear out things that are mobbing you like small monsters. Let's see. Before we get to some of the new mechanics, a couple more things. If we hold down guard and we hit triangle and circle at the same time, we go into Wyvern's Fire mode. That gives a few seconds to go off and charge up, but when it does, it unleashes a large burst directly in front of you. The impact is enough to push you back a little, and it does pretty massive amount of damage. Once you do that, your Gunlance will go into a cooldown state. Each particular Gunlance model shows the state differently. The Viper Lance shows the barrel being red hot like this. After a certain amount of time, I think it's 2 minutes or so, depending on your skills, it will cool down, reset, and you'll be able to do Wyvern's Fire again. The artillery skill, as we saw in the description, boosts the rate that cooldown happens, which means you'll be able to use it more often. Wyvern's Fire is sort of high risk, high reward in that it requires a startup time, so you don't want to use it unless the monster is in a vulnerable state. Okay, that definitely wasn't 2 minutes. The barrel's cooled off, which means my Wyvern's Fire is recharged. I'm able to use it again. Usually if people can incapacitate the monster or knock it down, and you're not in danger of hitting your teammates, Wyvern's Fire is useful for piling on the damage, but it does have an explosive radius that will knock your teammates over. So you have to be a little bit careful when you use it. Pick your shots. Alright. Next up, I want to talk a little bit about the shelling type. As you can see on the right, the Viper Toby Gunlance is a long type level 5. The level is an indicator of the overall power of whatever shot you're using has. And the shelling type can be one of 3 different types for Gunlance. There's normal, there's long, and there's wide. The normal Gunlance has a larger clip of shells, and it does more damage when you do full bursts as a result. The long type has a larger radius or longer hit range when you're shelling compared to the others. If we point at the target, it's kind of hard to see because I'm facing over the shoulder here, but the overall distance that I can actually be from the target and still have my shells hit is pretty considerable. Both the normal and wide have to be closer in order for the shots to go off, but long has the ability to do that from a distance. In addition to having more range on its shot type, long shot Gunlance benefits from charge shots, which I haven't shown off yet. If we trigger our shell by holding down circle, you do a charged shell, which takes a little bit to charge up and go off, but it does overall more damage. And long shot Gunlance gets an additional damage boost for charge shot types. That's its innate bonus. And the neat thing about this is the time to charge and go off for charge shells are affected by focus. In other words, if I didn't have focus on and I was trying to charge shell, they'd take probably 2 or so seconds to go off instead of almost instantly. As a result, pairing our skills with focus for long shot means we can fire off these long charge shells relatively quickly and do a decent amount of damage. The wide Gunlance shell type has a bit of a burst and is a close range shot, but it does more damage per shell compared to the other two types. The clip size as a result for wide is the smallest, with 2 base and 3 with capacity up. And the main point of wide shot lancing involves mixing up pokes with shells in order to capitalize on the damage per shell. You don't get a boost to charge shells for wide, which is why people don't usually run focus on that type of build. Going through Monster Hunter World Vanilla, I think I mentioned it before. When I ran through the game on PS4, I ran Gunlance, and I ran normal for pretty much the majority of Vanilla World. When Iceborne came out, I switched to wide. The overall damage and wide type Gunlances I got took me pretty much to the end game. And it wasn't until I got to the very end game that I started experimenting with long shot and a focus build. And because I like the ability to pick my shots and focus fire on the enemy, I ended up liking the long shot build the best. So as a result, that's the build type I've moved towards for our playthrough of Iceborne on PC. And maybe at some point, once I get more time to play around in the end game, I might tweak my Gunlance build and show off the other shot types. But for now, when we take the Gunlance out, we'll be using long, since that's what I've built. Okay. Before we exit the tutorial and move into the actual story progression, I want to talk a little bit about what was added for Iceborne, because there are some really nifty tricks for the Gunlance that they got in Iceborne that weren't in the base game. And it has to do with the addition of the Clutch Claw. Like we've seen on the other weapons, if we hit L2 with our weapon out, we can use the Clutch Claw. If we hit circle, we can grapple onto things. I won't reset the stage here, but if I grapple onto a target and hit triangle, I'll do my weapon attack, which is a piercing shell, and doing that successfully on a target will cause it to drop slinger ammo. And the reason why slinger ammo is important for Gunlance is if we have slinger ammo on hand, if we attack and then hit L2 and circle at the same time, we load what's called the Worm Stake Blast. This takes all of the slinger ammo we had on our person and loads it into our Gunlance. And right away, that offers no real change to the overall behavior of the weapon itself. Our pokes are not any different. Our movement, nothing else is different. But if we go into the Worm Stake prompt, and we'll do that just by shelling twice, instead of launching an exploding stake that sticks in the enemy and then explodes after a set amount of time, thanks to the ammo we've loaded, we've now deployed a Worm Stake Blast. And this is a temporary object that lodges into the monster wherever you stick it, and it'll stay there for a set amount of time based on the rarity of the slinger ammo you load. Over time, the little boosters will slowly burn down and it'll fall off on its own after a couple minutes or so. The reason why the Wormstake Blast is important is if you shell it, it'll explode and do additional damage. With a basic uncharged shell, that's 28 damage. So when I'm shelling the target here, I'm doing 53 and 28 bonus from the Wormstake Blast. With a long type, if I do a charge shell, we get 84, which is a considerable boost to the overall damage per shot. Using Wormstake Blast basically gives the Gunlance additional damage output. If you can stick the Wormstake Blast onto a monster and then hit it with shells, you get successive additional damage. And if you knock the monster over and have the chance to unload a full clip, that's pretty sizable damage boost on top of your hits. On top of that, if we use Wyvern's Fire on the Wormstake Blast, we get four additional bursts that go off in addition to our regular blast, as they're impacting off of this thing and doing more damage. Finally, if we do the regular Wormstake, it behaves the same way. All of the artillery-based attacks from the Gunlance, when they hit an impaled Wormstake Blast, do additional damage, which can really add up if you play it correctly. The downside of this being the animation takes a little while to actually stick the projectile onto a target, but if you can do it successfully when you have an opening and then pile the damage on, you can really lock down a monster and keep the DPS up. It's a pretty neat addition to the Gunlance's overall arsenal, and I do think it's pretty fun. Tricky, but fun. And that's kind of how I would describe this weapon overall. It is a technically complicated weapon, but once you take the time to learn it and figure it out, it's a lot of fun. And that's why the Gunlance has been my main weapon for Monster Hunter World, Vanilla, and Iceborne. So that's a real quick and dirty overview of some basics with the Gunlance. I say quick, and we've been talking about this for almost half an hour. But when we take this out on hunts, which I do plan to do in this session, hopefully, I'll be able to sort of demonstrate the different mechanics that I talked about here and show what they look like in action against an actual target. But for now, we'll go back to town and proceed with the actual story beats. I am going to switch back to Greatsword for this required quest, and if I decide to do some side stuff later, then I'll probably swap in the Gunlance and demonstrate some of the stuff I've been talking about here.